ended.
Hashem.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me. So nice to have a Thursday evening program. I'm normally just, in my kitchen. So this is really nice. Nice break from the cooking. Thank you. So the title of the shir that I gave you... I'm
just going to begin by saying, don't think people aren't listening because their screens are off. So only a few of us keep them on. We do try and encourage them, but it's fine. So let's go.
You never know what people are doing behind their off screens. Maybe you shouldn't encourage them. Maybe they're off for a reason. Okay, so we start with a question. Is Pinchas, this is confusing because actually the Sedra this week is Balak, but at the end of this Sedra is this whole story that takes place with Pinchas. Now, next week's Sedra is actually called Pinchas because the story continues into next week's parasha, but I am actually talking about this week's parasha, but it also works if anyone's listening in from Israel because they actually are on Pinchas. But the story of Pinchas spans 2 weeks. So we're introduced to him this week in Parashas Balak, and it's a really difficult story to understand. It's one of those where you just think there's something about it doesn't quite sit well, and it needs to be really looked into quite carefully to get a handle on exactly what's going on and why. So I started with the question, is Pinchas being vigilant or is he a vigilante? And hopefully by the end of this, we'll have some more ideas and maybe we can solve it together. So to do that, to solve this problem, we really have to understand the context in which this story is taking place, because we all know that over time, our societal norms change. So in order to illustrate that, I'm just going to put up on the screen a really good illustration that I came across, that even over the course of our own lifetime, we can see that societal norms have changed dramatically, right? So women's fashion definitely is not what it once was, for better or for worse. I'm not commenting either way, but it certainly is different, right? Our leadership has definitely changed over time, right? I'm not even commenting on the leadership. I don't really want to go there, but I'm sure we all have ideas of what it could or should be and what it once was. And definitely things have changed. The way men style their hair, right? You can see it, father and son, very different looks going on. What do we have next? We've got, am I going a bit too fast? Hang on a minute. We've got a teacher and her student. He used to present her with flowers and now he's holding a gun to her head. That has definitely gone downhill. Okay, that one I am willing to comment on. You've got these women who are pulling a plow and working very hard. And nowadays you've got a very similar thing going on, but they are paying for this privilege rather than being paid to do this. Working really, really hard. I mean, maybe the outfits have improved somewhat. You've got a very different look going on here for people's beach attire, right? We used to have shorts that were multicolored. Now we have bodies that are multicolored, and that has also changed a lot over time. You've got men's fashion. Men's fashion has also evolved a lot over the course of our lifetimes. And then we get to technology, right? Technology has shrunk and we have grown in size. And that is a nice illustration of how different computers look and how different people look nowadays. In terms of what kids do with their time, we've got a boy flying a kite and we've got a boy nowadays flying a drone. Okay, so similar idea, but very different kind of technology. This is a row of men standing outside shops reading a newspaper. That's not what you would see anymore nowadays. Now you see a row of men standing looking at their phones, right? We're quite used to seeing this kind of look going on outside. And when there's this 1996, you've got a mum dragging her son in from outdoors. He's been playing outdoors all day. And nowadays you've got her dragging him outside because he's refusing to leave his house because he's so engrossed on his screen. So again, that has changed a lot. I think this is the final one. Again, it's a play on technology where, our TVs have shrunk in size and we have grown in size. And finally, telephones used to unite the family. You could get in touch with people from all over the world. And now you can have all your family in the same room as you and completely ignore them. Right? So everything changes a lot over time. And we see from here that, some changes are good, some changes are less good. And these things, they do change over time, and it's well worth keeping on top of how these things change and sorry, I'm back to you, how these things change and how we change as a result of these changes. Because sometimes they're very gradual, they happen very slowly, and we don't always notice them happening. So just one more story to highlight how these things have changed. This one really made me laugh because it was just, oh, I'll tell you the story and you tell me if you relate to this. So my daughter Talia, it was a couple of years ago, she was about 4 at the time, and she came across a CD player in my house. Now she's used to an Alexa, that's what she's grown up with. And she found this CD player and she asked me what it was because she'd never seen it before. So I said, she said, what does it do? So I said, it plays music. So she said to me, and what is it called? So I said, it's called a CD player. So she turns around to it and says, CD player, play me a song. And she was like, shocked that I didn't do anything, right? Because she's a generation that's grown up with talking to technology, that as soon as you talk to an object, it does exactly what you do. And I was cracking up because she's only asked what it was called to find out how to address it so that it would listen to her commands, not because she wanted to know what the name of the item was. So again, we see that things change dramatically, sometimes within a very short period of time. And often our experiences of what's going on around us, they form our opinions subconsciously. Right? Sometimes the society or the generation that we've grown up in, they majorly affect the way we see things, and we're very influenced by society. But my question is really, who determines for each society what the norm is? So what we're going to do this evening is we're going to trace the path of this generation of Jewish people wandering through the Midbar. And even in that 40-year period, we're going to see how their norms evolved. And it's really important to know when you're studying Torah, when events are taking place, because in order to understand the story, you have to understand the context that is taking place in. Who are the people involved? What's gone on previously? You know, what is the time period? And put it inside the big picture of what else is going on at the time. So the other interesting thing is when you look at the Torah, there's very different amounts of time in each of the books of the Torah. So if we start with the Book of Vayikra, the Book of Vayikra, it spans well over 2,000 years. It's the book that we know best, but there must have been other events going on in those 2,000 years. But there's a few stories that we pick out and we focus on. The Book of Shemos, it takes place over maybe a few hundred years. And again, the major story really going on is the Jews in Egypt. There's obviously other stuff going on at the time, but the Torah chooses which bits to tell us so that we can follow what is going on at the time, so that it's stuff that's important to us, and that the Torah feels, Hashem feels it's important for us to know whatever generation you are reading the Torah in, it will have some kind of relevance to you. The Book of Vayikra, a lot of people don't know this, the whole of the Book of Vayikra, where we go in intricate detail of exactly everything that happens in the Mishkan, and there's loads of stories that take place in it. All of those stories take place on only one day. The whole book takes place on one day, which is the first day of Nisan in the first year after they've left Egypt. So it's a whole year after they've left Mitzrayim. It's the first day of the second year. And even the beginning of the Book of Bamidbar is still in that first year, that the beginning of the second year. So 1 year on from when they left Mitzrayim. And we're going to see over the course of the Book of Bamidbar, there's loads and loads of stories in Bamidbar, but they majorly focus only on 2 periods of time. There's stories that take place in that first year after they leave Egypt, the first and second year, and there's stories that take place in the 40th year. But there's this massive gap in the middle of 38 years that we don't know anything that happened. We only know that they are traveling, but we don't know any kind of detail about what happens, who does what, who says what. We've got a few stories that are picked out, but only from those 2 sections, right from the very beginning of the Midbar and right from the very end of the Midbar. And it's important to know when you read a story, which time it's taking place, because depending on when it's taking place, it depends who it's taking place to. And we know different people experience things in different ways because we only have our own life experiences. We don't different people living in different times will experience things in different ways. So it's really important to understand how these stories take place. So if we go right back to the beginning of Bamidbar, we start off, it's still the end of this first day of the first of Nisan, which is chronicled in the Book of Vayikra, and it's talking about lighting the menorah and all of these things. The first major story really we get to is Shalach Lecha. So the story of Shalach Lecha is when Moshe sends spies to the land of Israel, and we know what happens. It all goes horribly wrong. It starts off with, it seems like a sensible idea to send spies ahead to see what's going on in the land before they enter it. And remember what's happened to them so far. They've left Egypt, they've received the Torah, they've built the Mishkan, they're on track, they're literally right at the border of Israel, ready to go in, and they send in the spies, and it all goes wrong because they come back with a bad report of the land. And the people cry that night, and we're just about to go into the 3 weeks, which leads us up to Tisha B'Av. And that night that they cry all night, Hashem tells us is going to be Tisha B'Av, that for future generations, every time something bad is going to happen to us, is always going to happen on Tisha B'Av, as a reminder to us of this night where we cried for nothing. Hashem's going to remind us he's still here and still waiting for us to get back up to that level where we will be in Eretz Israel, keeping the Torah as one nation with Mashiach. So that's the aim. Let's hope we get there this year in time. We've got 3 weeks to do it in. Amen from Rebbetzin and Dove. Okay, so it all went wrong. They come back with this bad report. They speak Lashon Hara. But to understand why they did that, we have to understand who these people are. So we said it's only 1 year after leaving Mitzrayim. Essentially, they're slaves, right? They've lived their entire life in slavery. They've been told exactly what to do, when to do it, and suddenly next, they're just elevated to this really, really high level and expected to just kind of be on board with that. It wasn't like they kind of worked on themselves and grew to a certain level. We know normally that, growth has to be a slow process, that we by step, but really from 1 second to the next, they've gone from being these downtrodden slaves to being on this highest possible level where God reveals himself at Har Sinai and gives us the Torah. And for some of them, it's just too much. And then they're told they're about to enter Israel, and they've got used to a year of living with mon, with bread falling from heaven. The sea's just been split. They've got all these open miracles taking place the whole time. And they're used to this, living a life of miracles. They've got a cloud protecting them and guiding them, and that's what they've got used to. And suddenly they're told you're going to have to go into Israel, you're going to have to work the land for yourself, you're going to be farmers, there's not going to be bread falling from heaven, you're going to have to fight battles, right? You're going to have to fight physical battles. You slaves who, they're probably not in the best health, they're probably a bit malnourished, they've never fought a war before, and they're told you're going to have to go in and conquer this land, and they've heard there's giants there. I have a bit of sympathy for them. I can understand why they're reluctant to do that, right? They're human beings. And actually that for some of them, it seems like that's too big an ask. And of course, for some of them, they know that they're never on their own. And of course, Hashem's going to help them. And of course, even living in a physical life, when you're a Jewish person, you've always got Hashem there. And there's always going to be miracles, whether they're open or not. But some of them just aren't on the level to think like that. And they're genuinely scared. And so they mess up. That's the story of the Meraglim. What happens next? Just to backtrack a bit, even before that takes place, at Har Sinai, very literally a few days later, they start serving a golden calf, which again, how can you serve a golden calf when you've only just received the Torah and had Hashem reveal himself to you? It's very obvious to you at that point that there's no such thing as idols. Why would you serve a golden calf? But again, that's the environment they've grown up in. They've grown up in a land full of idolatry. And when their leader, Moshe, leaves them, again, they get nervous and they go back to what they know best. They go back to idolatry because that's what they're so used to. And again, we can understand it. When you're feeling alone, you go back to what you know best. And that for them was Avodah Zarah. So even though it seems shocking to us, there's a bit of me that, again, we can understand it. Okay, the next thing that happens after, so that was in Shalach Lecha, the spies. The next story, big story, is Korach. Now, again, Korach only makes sense in the context that it happens. Korach launches a rebellion against Moshe, who was this amazing leader. But if he launched it even a few months earlier, there's no way he would have got anyone on board, because Moshe was amazing. They loved Moshe. He, against all odds, took them out of Egypt, and they saw the Egyptians drown in the sea, and God gave them the Torah. Moshe was amazing. No one's going to mess with Moshe. Why would you want someone like Korach when you've got Moshe? But he waited until a few things had gone wrong. Some people died when the Egel happened. Some people died when the story of the Spies happened. And there's a bit of a low mood, right? So when he senses that the mood is right, that's when he launches his rebellion. And they've already been told that all of the men between 20 and 60 are going to die in the wilderness, that they've got an extra 38 years of wandering around. They're feeling a bit depressed and a bit down, and maybe they feel like, oh, could do with a new leader. So he goes for it. He tries to launch this rebellion, which we see doesn't work. He gets swallowed up in the ground, and that's Parshas Korach. The very next parsha, in Parshas Chukas, we have another really interesting story, which again you can only understand in the context that it takes place. So by the time we get to the story in Chukas, we've fast forwarded 38 years, and we're in the final year of the Midbar. And in that year, a sad thing happens, and Miriam dies. Miriam was the leader of all the women. She was literally the female equivalent of Moshe. She was the, what would we call her? The chief Rebbetzin, yeah? And the women all looked up to her, and she'd led them in song, and she'd sung at the sea. And, she was the go-to woman, and she had just died. And the very next pasuk tells us that suddenly all the people come, they've just buried Miriam, all the people come and complain to Moshe and Aaron. Why do they come and complain? Because as soon as Miriam dies, the well stops. The well stops working, there's no water, and the people get in a massive panic because they're in a desert and it's boiling hot and there's no water. That's very scary. Now, a lot of the commentaries link these two stories because they say, well, Miriam just died, and that's why the next thing that happens is that people complain about water because Miriam just died. So that's when the well dries up. That's why they're coming to complain. But there's a nuance there where some of the commentaries pick up on it. There should be there's like a missing bit of the story there. There's a section that should have happened, right? Miriam's been buried. What are Moshe and Aaron doing that week that the well dries up when all the people come and complain? Of course, Miriam's their sister, right? Moshe and Aaron are, of course, sitting Shiva. And that's the story, that's the context that this story takes place in. And there's actually a Midrash that says, it's such a sad Midrash to read. It goes through this dialogue between Aaron and Moshe. They're sitting Shiva, just the two of them in their Shiva house. And Moshe says to Aaron, look, all the people are coming. I can see loads of people coming. They must be coming to our Shiva to tell us how amazing Miriam was. And remember how close Moshe is to his sister Miriam. She's the one who orchestrated his birth. She prophesied that he was going to come into existence and lead the people out. She looked after him when he was a baby in the river. She was his female counterpart. She led the women when he led the men. They were really, really close, and she's just died, and he's sitting in mourning, and he sees all the people coming. He's like, oh, that's so nice. They're all coming to tell me what an amazing Rebbetzin she was, what an amazing challenge she made, how amazing her challahs were. And Aaron's looking at this mob, and he senses that's not what they're coming to do. He says to Moshe, I don't think that's why they're coming. They look angry to me. And there's a loud knock at the door of the tent, and Aaron goes to open the door, and nobody says a word about Miriam. They just get launched straight away into this massive tirade about, oh, there's no water, and we're all going to die, and why did you bring us here, and why did you take us out of Egypt? You've done such a terrible thing. And Moshe's sitting there like, I don't understand. Like, Miriam's just is my Shiva. What is going on here? Nobody says anything to him about it. So Moshe, on any other day, he would have coped with it much better. He was an amazing leader. They're always complaining to him, and normally he just deals with it. But on this day, when he's sitting in mourning and he's going through a personal thing, he can't handle it, and he completely loses it with them. He screams at them, Shimon Hamarim, listen up, you rebels, and he ends up hitting the rock. And that was catastrophic, not just for him, but for all of us, because we're still living with the result of that nowadays. Moshe hits the rock, and as a result, he's punished that he and Aaron are not allowed into Israel. If Moshe had been the one to take us into Israel, if he had been the one to conquer the land and to build the Beis Hamikdash, it would have been a whole different story. The commentaries tell us it would never have been destroyed. Such was the level of Moshe. And if it had never been destroyed, we would all be living in messianic times now. You know, the last 2,000 years of our history would never have happened just because of this one moment. But now let's go back to what's actually happening in that moment. Why did the people get in such a panic that there's no water? So Rashi tells us on the first pasuk in that parak that actually this generation of people, they are all newbies. They are all the youngsters. All the people from the generation that grew up in Egypt, the men between 20 and 60 had all died. These youngsters were all people who were born in the desert. They didn't know that the well was Miriam's well. We call it Be'er Miriam. It's not called that in the Torah. They just call it the well, because they just think it's normal to have a rock follow you around everywhere and produce water. Like, we know that that's not what happens in the desert, right? That's common sense. That's not what happens in a desert. In a desert, you die of thirst because there's no water. They don't know that, right? Their norm, their natural existence is that food falls from heaven and that water follows them around in a well. And suddenly this day that Miriam dies, they were like, what do you mean? Where's the well gone? What's going on? They've got no idea. They didn't even connect it to Miriam's death until suddenly Moshe puts it together. And it's like, it was in Miriam's zachus. There was a whole generation of tzaddikim. None of them merited this water apart from Miriam. She was the one who kept them all going and provided water for all of them. And they didn't even realize until after she'd gone, because that was their normal, right? So we keep coming back to this idea of what is normal at the time that you are living in. Okay, so what happens next? That leads us on to this story that we have this week, Parshas Balak. So after Miriam dies, Moshe is told he's not allowed into Eretz Yisrael. The next thing is there's a series of wars. There's a war against Sichon and against Og, who are two massive kings. They were like the two superpowers at the time. And Moshe and the Bnei Israel asked both of them, can they pass through their land in order to get into Israel? Because they're just on the border now, they're about into Israel. And they both say no. And not only do they say no, they actually go to war with the Jewish people. And they're not so scared of the Jewish people. You know, we're not known for our strength particularly, right? We weren't that numerous yet. And, you know, slaves, we don't have an army. We never fought a war before. These were the two most powerful giants. The whole world has heard of them. They go to war with us and we absolutely whip them, right? They didn't stand a chance against us, not because of us, obviously, but because of Hashem. And after that, the whole world is quaking in their boots. They're petrified of the Jews because they realize what a powerful ally we have in Hashem. And Balak, who is the king of Moab, he is right on the border of Israel. And Bnei Israel have just decimated Sichon and Og. Everyone's petrified of them. He's wondering, it's obviously going to be me next. What should I do? So he has this bright idea to hire Bilam. Now, Bilam was, I don't know, he probably advertised in the Yellow Pages like Novi for hire. He seems to be involved in every single... He like goes around from group to group. Anytime we've ever had an argument with anyone, Bilam's suddenly part of their nation. He pops up again and again throughout history. And he's always there trying to mess with us for some reason. And Balak hires him to curse the Jews. And he has this whole interaction with a talking donkey. I feel like Shrek's really ruined this story for me because all I can picture is the donkey from Shrek. That's my only reference point for a talking donkey. I'm sure he didn't look like that. Anyway, this donkey keeps trying to stop Bilam from going to curse the Jews because obviously Hashem doesn't want him to. And Bilam doesn't quite get the message. He goes ahead anyway. And Hashem tells him, you're only going to be able to say whatever I tell you to say. So he tries again and again to curse us. And each time he comes out with another blessing. And Balak's getting more and more annoyed. He's like, I've hired you to curse them and you're just giving them more and more blessings. And the final blessing he blesses us with is the bracha that we know from davening of Matov Ohalecha Yaakov, Mishkanosecha Yisrael. How beautiful are your tents, Yaakov, your dwelling places, Israel. And what he's commenting on is actually, as you can imagine, if you're living on a campsite for your entire life, there's not much privacy, right? The walls of a tent are not very thick. And I don't know, they didn't have the same kind of planning laws that we have nowadays. But the one thing they did have similar to us is that they had this understanding of privacy laws, right? So at the moment when you're extending your property, right, the surveyor will come around and check that your view is not looking over onto your neighbor. And that's exactly what Bilam comments on. He says, it's amazing how even though you're all cramped in this kind of tent site and campsite in the middle of a desert, none of you have doors that are looking into anyone else's doors, because everyone tried to maintain the kedusha, the holiness of their home, so that what goes on behind closed tent doors stays behind closed tent doors, because that's important, right? It's important to have boundaries, that, you know, there's a feeling that what happens in my family home stays in my family home, a feeling of privacy. And he praises them for it. Now, what do these three stories have in common? You've got first the Korach story, then you've got the death of Miriam in Chukas, and then you've got the talking donkey in Balak. So all three of these stories involve something called a mouth. So the first one was Pi Haaretz, the mouth of the earth, which swallowed Korach. The second one is Pi Haba'er, the mouth of the well, which was Miriam's well. And the third one is Pi Ha'ason, the mouth of the talking donkey. And all three of these are part of a group of 10 things that Pirkei Avos tells us were created Bein Hashmashos at twilight. So on day 6, when Hashem has finished doing all of his creating, he keeps these last 10 things to just twilight. You know, when you're like running around and faffing and making sure you've got your candles ready and like your hot plate set. That's what we're doing on Erev Shabbos. On Erev Shabbos, Hashem was creating these 10 things. And Rabbeinu Yonah tells us that the thing that all of them have in common is that they have the potential for a miracle. So it could be they don't get used, or it could be that they do get used. But they all get used in different ways at various times throughout history, and some get used repeatedly. So, for example, one of them is the stick of Moshe, and that stick has done so many things over the years. It started off as Adam's stick, and it got passed down and down through the generations. It became eventually Yaakov's stick, and Yosef had it, and Yehuda had it, and it ended up in Paro's palace, and then Yisro takes it, and then Moshe takes it, and Aaron shares it with him, and eventually it's going to be the stick that Moshiach uses. And it's also the stick that they perform the miracles with at the sea and all of the plagues. And it's the stick of Aaron that flowers. So this stick gets used again and again in many different ways, many different miracles. But these three, we have them one parsha after another. They've all got mouths, and they were all designated for miracles. And I just wanted to highlight that, again, this generation, this 40-year span, the nation are used to dealing with miracles. They're living in a miraculous way. That is their norm the whole time. They've got food falling from the sky. They've got water following them around. They've got clouds of protection. Their normal is miracles. And they've got to the end of the 40 years. And bearing in mind everything we've said up until now, it's going to be really hard for them to transition. They're going to have to change to a natural lifestyle. They're going to be fighting wars. They're going to be working the land. And of course, there were still miracles, but they were accompanied by nature. So, for example, the walls of Jericho, they fall down by a miracle, but the people go in and fight. So it's like, it's a balance. There's a bit of physicality, but there's also this miraculous bit as well. But I think at this stage, people don't quite understand how it's all going to work. And they've been told as well that Moshe's not going to be with them, that he's kind of going into retirement, he's going to die, he's not the appropriate leader anymore to take this new group of people into the land, and that Yeshua is going to take over for them. Because Moshe, he's been through a lot. I feel very sorry for Moshe, because he literally lived his whole life looking after these people, and his dream was to go into the land, and he never makes it in. And he's just been through this big trauma. He's lost his sister. Aaron also dies at the end of the same Parshas Chukas. So now it's just him left all alone. He's been through all this hard stuff. He's been told he's not going to be allowed in. So again, it's kind of right. The conditions are right for another rebellion. But this time it's much more subtle. It's not a battle for leadership, but actually the people are at a point where they're not feeling great about themselves. They're worried about their future. They're not sure how it's going to go. And Bilam and Balak use that to their advantage. And Bilam's parting shot, he tells Balak, I'm not going to be able to curse them. The one piece of advice I have for you is that God hates immorality. If you can get them to be immoral, that's your way in. Then you can curse them. Then you might be able to win against them. So how do they go from living on this completely spiritual plane to a completely physical one? Really, what happened in the end was that they went too far and they became entirely physical. And somewhere along the lines, they lost their spirituality. So this is what happens. It says, Vayeshev Yisrael b'Shittim, that Bnei Israel were dwelling in a place called Shittim, Vayachal ha'om liznos el benos Moav. And the people profaned themselves by whoring with the Moabite women. Vatikrona la'om lezivchei elokeihen, sacrifice to their gods. Vayochal ha'om, and the people ate, vayishtachavu le'elokeihen, and they bowed down to their god. And then Israel attached itself to their god, who was called Baal Pa'ar, and Hashem was incredibly angry. So how did they go from this Matovu Halecha, they're so concerned about their privacy and the Kedusha of their home, and just a short while later, they're literally out on the streets, in public, just sleeping with random women and serving Avodah Zarah. The mind boggles. Like, how do you get from all the way up here to all the way down there? And how does that transition happen? So there's a Midrash called Sefer Hayashar, which describes the process that they go through, because the Moabites know that they're not going to be able to just win them over straight away. They do it very gradually. The Jewish people are encamped just by Moab, and what they do is the Moabite men, rather than going to war with them because they know they're not going to win, they befriend them. They start hanging out together. You know, when one of them is outside their tent, they'll invite somebody in. They'll say to this guy, hi, what's your name? You know, we're all brothers. We're also all descended from Esau. And so we're family. Come in. And the Midrash described them being invited in for sacrificial meat and wine, which, you know, for us would be like inviting someone in for a barbecue and a beer, right? So the men are standing around. They say, come for a barbecue, come for a beer. We'll hang out. It'll be fun. And the men do it. They come into their homes and they get used to them and they enjoy their company and it's all very nice. And meanwhile, the Moabite men are telling their women, dress up in your nicest clothes, just be around. Yeah, just hang out. And then when they get really, really drunk and they've lost all their inhibitions, that's when you make your move. And that's exactly what happened. The men became more and more comfortable with each other. They became comfortable in their homes. And then the women also, they became, you know, like people that they saw in passing, they'd hang out with them. And then your boundaries just move further and further and further. And eventually it just doesn't seem like such a big deal. It's very gradual and it just doesn't seem like a big deal. And what happens is there's a plague that starts in which 24,000 people die. Like, that is a lot of people to have made such a huge mistake. And it all comes to a head when eventually they feel so comfortable with what they're doing that this guy doesn't mention him straight away by name. It mentions his name later. He's called Zimri, and he was the son of the Nossi, the prince of the tribe of Shimon. So this is like an important family. They're like, you know, the elite of the people. Really, he should have known a bit better. And he goes up to Moshe and all of the elders, all of the members of the Sanhedrin who are all standing around, and he says to them, he schleps this woman in, he pulls her by her hair, it says, and he says to Moshe, this is how he addresses him, like, he's so rude. He says, son of Amram, right? Doesn't even call him by name, he just calls him son of Amram. Is this woman forbidden or permitted? And before Moshe even has a chance to answer, he says to him, can you imagine the chutzpah of saying this to Moshe Rabbeinu? And if you say that she is forbidden, what about the daughter of Yisro, to whom you are married? She's also from Midian. Who permitted her to you? And Moshe is just standing there like, I can't believe he just said, like, he can't believe he just said that to him. And Moshe is so humble, he's never going to stick up for himself. Of course, it's not comparable at all. This was before Matan Torah, and Zipporah was a Giyores, she converted, and it's just not comparable at all. And he's literally waving it in their face. And all of the Gedolim, all of the important rabbis, they're all standing around watching this happen. And they're standing, it says in the post, they're standing and crying. They're in pain about what's going on, but nobody says anything. they're all like too shocked, or it's kind of become the norm, and they don't want to be the one to say, like, actually this isn't okay, until one person comes, Pinchas, the son of Elazar, the son of Aaron the Kohen. He saw and he rose from the congregation and he took a spear in his hand. Now, I think that's really interesting, because Pinchas was not one of these guys who's walking around with a spear. He's not someone that's always like looking for a fight. He's the grandson of Aaron, who we know was Ohev Shalom, Verodei Shalom. He's all about peace. He's a pacifist. He has to go and find a spear. But when he sees the depths that they've sunk to, and no one else is taking a stand, he says, you know what, this is not right. I need to do something about this. And he follows Zimri and this Midianite woman Cosby into their tent, and he just puts his spear through both of them, and everyone is in such shock. He kind of waves them around on his spear to show everyone what he's done, and he's in such shock that it puts a stop to the plague. Everyone suddenly takes a moment, it's like, hang on a minute, what am I doing? I can't do this. Pinchas is right, we've got to stop this, this is terrible. And they all stop what they're doing, and as a reward, Pinchas gets an incredible reward. He gets the Kohuna, he and his descendants are Kohanim forever. He gets a bris shalom, so covenant of peace, because he's a pacifist, and he gets blessed with a very long life. And some people even say that Pinchas was Eliyahu, who we are told never died. So that is a very, very long life. So there's definitely a discussion to be had about whether Pinchas did the violence ever the answer. I don't think the point of this story is that we should go around impaling people who we disagree with. I don't think that is the take-home message. So what is actually the point? Because the words used to describe Pinchas is he had kinna, which we translate either as jealousy or as zealousness. And in Pirkei Avos it says that it's not a good thing, that it says hakina v'hatava v'hakavod motzin es ha'adam min ha'olam, that jealousy removes a person from the world. So what's really the difference between zeal and jealousy? And is it a good thing or a bad thing? So I think it comes down to a question of, who are you jealous for? Is it for yourself, for your own benefit? Or in Pinchas's case, he was jealous on God's behalf, on Hashem's behalf. He's like, how can they be doing this to Hashem? That's a terrible thing. And he takes a stand, and actually he was keeping to halacha, the actual law, and he checked with Moshe before he goes ahead and does it. He says, I think you told us that if this ever happens, that we should kill them. And Moshe says, you know what, you're right, go ahead and do it. And he does it. So it's clear that it's out of character for him. It's clear he's naturally a pacifist. Hashem makes a bris shalom with him. And I think his situation was unique. He did the right thing at the right time for the situation that he was in. It doesn't mean that we should go around killing everyone that we're not happy with what they're doing. But I think he teaches us a lesson that sometimes we're uncomfortable to say that we're uncomfortable with something, right? If something's going on around us, everyone else is kind of just nodding along, but maybe everyone there is thinking, I'm not very comfortable with this. And sometimes that's how societal norms evolve. Just nobody says that actually this isn't okay. And everyone assumes that everyone else agrees and that they're the weirdo who doesn't really agree with everyone, until that one person says, you know what, I actually don't think that we should be doing this. And then suddenly everyone pipes up and says, I'm so pleased you said that. I didn't want to be the one to say it, but now that you've said that, I actually really agree with you. And the general consensus is, okay, well, let's just stop. So I think at the end of this story, it's important to work out for ourselves, to take a step back from what the norms are around us and to work out what is it that we really think for ourselves, not just what society has dictated for us, but really what do we genuinely think about things. And what are the principles that we're going to take a stand about? A non-violent stand. But what are those things that we, if we see it around us, we're going to actually speak up and say, you know what, in a very polite way, say, I don't think that that is the right thing to be doing. I really feel very strongly about this. I hope you don't mind me saying so. But, I think this is how we should be doing it. And if we're brave enough and strong enough to be the one to stand up for ourselves and our beliefs, then that will have a ripple effect on the community around us, and also will teach our children that principles are important, that you should stick to your principles and make sure that those around you that you're surrounding yourselves with people who are feeling the same as you and doing the same as you, and teach our children to do the same. So